May 12, 1945, German women prisoners lined up, bracing for punishment, fear heavy in their eyes. They expected anger, hunger, and hard labor, but instead, they were handed soap, clean towels, warm showers, and even fresh bread. One of them whispered in disbelief, "We thought we would suffer. Instead, we were treated like humans." How could this be? Why did America treat its enemy this way, right after the most brutal war in history? Stay with us as we uncover this forgotten story. Don't forget to subscribe, hit like and watch till the end to support the channel and hear the full truth of what happened. The Reich had collapsed like a house set alight from within. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, but for tens of thousands of young women in uniform, clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, and Red Cross workers, the end of fighting did not mean peace. It meant captivity. Their world was one of shattered streets and smoking ruins, and now of whispered rumors. The propaganda of the last months had painted the Allies in monstrous colors. Americans were brutes, Russians were beasts, and any woman who fell into their hands would pay with dignity or worse. In the rubble of Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, such fears clung heavier than the dust in the air. One nurse wrote in her diary, "We were told the Americans would treat us like animals, that we should expect no mercy, only scorn." These words were not rare. They were repeated in the barracks and in the lines of weary prisoners marching west. Yet paradox already pulsed beneath the surface. Even in surrender, the Reich still broadcast its venom, insisting the enemy would brutalize them. But the evidence under their feet, orderly columns, guards who gave them water on long marches, bandages offered even to prisoners, cracked the tale they had swallowed whole. The numbers were vast. Over 370,000 German prisoners of war were transported to the United States between 1942 and 1945, a logistical feat that required more than 400 voyages across the Atlantic. Among them were thousands of women, auxiliaries, nurses, and support staff, who carried both the weight of defeat and the invisible shackles of rumor. The streets they left behind offered a sensory memory of despair. The smell of smoke and burnt brick lingered over flattened districts. Bread was little more than sawdust and turnip paste, leaving mouths coated with bitterness. Boots wore thin, socks tore open, and cold seeped in as if through the skin itself. The war had taught them to expect less than nothing. And yet, as the days of surrender stretched on, strange contradictions appeared. Where they had braced for vengeful reprisals, they found process. Where they had braced for jeers, they found silence, even paperwork. A Red Cross nurse captured it simply, "I feared fists. Instead, I saw pens, lists, signatures." This was the first fracture in the narrative of cruelty. But it was only the beginning. For these women, captivity would not confirm the Reich's warnings, it would undo them. They would step into a world of iron beds, white bread, and eventually, soap. And each small discovery would feel like an assault not on their bodies but on their beliefs. What they did not yet know, standing in ruins and rumors, was that their next journey, westward in crowded boxcars, would carry them not into punishment but into paradox. The journey began in silence, broken only by the cough of locomotives and the shuffle of boots on splintered wood. Boxcars built for cattle and freight now carried women in grey uniforms westward. The war had ended, but the war's weight remained in every smell and sound. Straw scattered across the floor, damp with condensation, mixed with the sharp odour of coal smoke drifting in from the engine. The iron clank of the couplings punctuated each mile, a rhythm of uncertainty. These were not volunteers but captives of circumstance. Young nurses from field hospitals, typists from Luftwaffe offices, Red Cross auxiliaries caught when their units disbanded. They carried only small bundles, a spare dress, perhaps a family photograph, maybe a diary tucked into a jacket seam. The Reich's promises of glory had collapsed. What remained were whispered warnings about what awaited them. The irony was sharp. They travelled deeper into enemy custody, expecting humiliation, even death. Yet many of their guards treated them with a quiet professionalism. Water buckets were passed through the sliding doors at station halts. A corporal even slipped a woman a crust of bread. For some, the smallest kindness stung more than cruelty would have, because it contradicted everything drilled into them for years. One nurse, Katha Muller, later remembered, "We were herded into the wagons like cattle, and yet they gave us blankets. I could not reconcile it." Was this the America we had been told about? The statistics told another story beneath the surface. In the summer of 1945, Allied transport lines were at their peak. Up to 50,000 German prisoners a week were being moved from Europe's ports to staging camps. Railways ran constantly, shuttling defeated soldiers and auxiliaries alike to ships waiting at Le Havre, Cherbourg and Bremen. Through the slats in the boxcars, the women saw what Germany had become. Entire towns flattened into jagged teeth of brick, fields pockmarked with shell craters, smoke still curling from collapsed roofs, weeks after bombardment, children scavenging for firewood along the tracks, their thin arms waving at the trains with a mixture of curiosity and accusation. The paradox cut deep. These women were leaving devastation behind, yet feared they were headed toward something worse. In one diary, written in cramped pencil by a 22-year-old secretary named Hildegard, the line reads, "We go west into the mouth of the beast. At least in ruins, we knew the soil beneath our feet." But even the boxcars betrayed hints that the Reich had lied. When the train paused at sidings, American officers counted heads with clipboards, not clubs. The order of it, the paperwork, the lists, the regulations, unsettled women who had braced for chaos and vengeance. As night fell, the trains groaned across bridges and into ports, lit faintly by Allied searchlamps. The air changed there, salt, tar and diesel, replacing the acrid stench of bombed-out towns. Dockside cranes swung overhead, loading crates and cargo, while German women watched from narrow openings in the wood. One whispered to another, "Do you hear it? The ships breathe like monsters. The hissing steam, the churn of winches, the deep throb of engines at anchor." It was a soundscape entirely foreign to their ruined homeland. They did not know it yet, but these docks marked a threshold. Soon they would trade the rattle of boxcars for the swell of the Atlantic, seasickness for stew, fear for bewilderment. What they would find aboard those ships, in meals, in discipline, even in medical checks, would begin dismantling the last scaffolds of Nazi propaganda. The trains had carried them out of ruins. The sea would carry them into paradox. The ships loomed like steel fortresses against the horizon, their grey hulls blotting out the morning sun. At Bremen and Le Havre, lines of prisoners shuffled toward gangways, their boots clanging against metal ramps slick with sea mist. For many of the young German women, this was their first sight of the Atlantic, a restless expanse of grey-green water stretching farther than imagination. The air was heavy with salt and diesel, a smell both alien and unnerving. They had been told this was the end. Rumours had warned of floating prisons, of starvation, of revenge enacted at sea. A whispered story repeated in the boxcars said prisoners would be thrown overboard once out of sight of land. The Reich's last weapon was fear, and it clung stubbornly even here. Yet the reality was something entirely different. As the engines rumbled and the ships pulled free of the docks, the prisoners were marched below deck, not into darkness and chains, but into berthing compartments. Rows of canvas bunks stretched in tiers, each with a wool blanket. A Navy petty officer, indifferent and efficient, barked orders to line up for food. And then came the true shock: trays of stew, thick with potatoes, carrots, even meat, and hunks of white bread so soft they seemed impossible. Coffee, strong and bitter, was ladled into tin cups. For women who had lived for months on blackened turnips and ersatz tea, it was less a meal than a revelation. One nurse later recalled, "We thought it must be a trick. Why feed us like this if we were to be punished?" The bread melted in the mouth. I felt ashamed to enjoy it. The statistics underline the scale of that paradox. Army Transportation Corps managed over 400 prisoner voyages across the Atlantic, provisioning each with rations calculated to Geneva Convention standards, roughly 3,500 calories per prisoner per day, compared to the 1,000 or fewer many had survived on in Germany's last months. Even aboard ships crowded with thousands of prisoners, meals came 3 times daily, organized with military precision. The sensory difference was overwhelming. The roll of the ship made some ill, the tang of vomit mingling with salt air in the corridors. But the abundance of food and the efficiency of distribution silenced even the loudest fears. Instead of beatings, there were headcounts. Instead of humiliation, there were inoculations from Navy medics who jabbed arms with practiced indifference. At night, the women lay in their bunks, listening to the deep throb of engines and the creak of steel plates. For the first time, some felt the weight of exhaustion lift. The ship became both cage and sanctuary. They were captives, but fed and sheltered, carried farther from the ruins of their homeland with each swell of the sea. One diary captured the emotional contradiction perfectly. I wanted to weep. My brothers fought to the death in the mud, and here I was, seasick and full of bread. How could both things be true? Days blurred into one another, marked only by the rhythm of meals, roll calls, and the distant cry of gulls before the ocean swallowed even birds. And then after nearly 2 weeks, the outlines of America rose from the haze, intact skylines, chimneys smoking, cars crawling on clean roads. For women who had left cities gutted and blackened, the sight of buildings standing whole was like seeing a world imagined in dreams. The journey across the Atlantic had stripped away their first layer of fear. Cruelty had not come. Starvation had not come. Instead, they found abundance delivered by indifferent hands. But the true shock, the moment that would etch itself into memory as paradox incarnate, awaited them not on the ships, but in the camps ashore, where they would meet the smallest of luxuries, soap. The first hours on American soil were not marked by cruelty, but by procedure. At ports in New Jersey, Virginia, and Louisiana, lines of German prisoners filed down gangways, clutching bundles of belongings. The air was heavy with humidity, and the sweet tang of pine or diesel, depending on where they disembarked. The women braced themselves for jeers, but the dock workers barely looked at them. To most Americans, they were not monsters, they were cargo. The march to the intake stations carried an eerie stillness. Orders were barked, clipboards ticked, and guards motioned with gestures more than with rifles. The prisoners were directed not to punishment chambers, but to a row of low wooden buildings with steam curling faintly from vents. Above the doors hung a word painted in English. They did not need translated: showers. Every rumour in Germany had made the same cruel promise. Showers were death. The stories from concentration camps had seeped even into military units. Many of the women whispered to one another, clutching hands, hearts pounding with the certainty that this was the end. And then paradox. Inside, they were ordered to undress. Their tattered uniforms were taken away, dropped into fumigation bins. American medics handed out paper tags and lined them up beneath nozzles. The hiss of pipes echoed against tiled walls. Some women wept, some closed their eyes and whispered prayers. But the nozzles released not gas, but water, clean, hot, rolling down in rivulets that carried weeks of filth away in moments. Then came something stranger still, bars of soap, smooth, white, fragrant, towels, thick, dry, freshly laundered. For young women who had not felt true cleanliness since before the war, the sensation was overwhelming. One POW nurse later confessed in a letter, "I held the soap as if it were treasure. The smell of it. It was freedom itself. I began to cry and could not stop." The statistics tell how deliberate this was. The US Army, following Geneva Convention protocols, processed hundreds of thousands of prisoners through delousing and sanitation stations, applying DDT powder, issuing clean underclothes, and supplying each with 2 bars of soap per month. It was not mercy, it was bureaucracy. Yet to the women it felt like grace. The sensory memory lodged deep. The sting of hot water on skin rubbed raw from weeks without bathing. The floral bite of American soap that clung to hair and hands. The crackle of fresh cotton uniforms replacing lice-ridden wool. Many emerged from the showers stunned into silence, shivering not from cold but from disbelief. A diary entry from a young auxiliary named Ilse captured the paradox. "We expected beatings. Instead, they gave us soap." I do not know what to believe anymore. It was not propaganda. It was daily life. The Reich had warned them to brace for hatred, but America offered sanitation. The smallest ritual of dignity, a shower, a towel, a bar of soap, struck harder at their convictions than any sermon could. As they were marched out into the sunlight, hair still damp, uniforms exchanged for camp-issue clothing, many whispered to each other that perhaps the real punishment was not cruelty, but kindness. The Reich had promised them honor, yet abandoned them to rot. The Americans, their enemies, had washed them clean. But this was only the beginning. Beyond the delousing sheds stretched the camps themselves, rows of barracks, mess halls, fences, and within those camps, the paradox would deepen. Because behind the barbed wire, life looked less like captivity and more like abundance. The camps were not cages of horror, but cities of order. At Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and dozens of others across the country, German women stepped into compounds that looked nothing like the dungeons they had imagined. Rows of wooden barracks stood in neat lines, shaded by trees, guard towers loomed at the corners, but rifles were shouldered casually, not pointed. Inside the wire, life was governed less by terror than by schedules. Every day began with a bugle call and roll. Names were checked against manifests, figures ticked on clipboards. Then came breakfast. For women who had grown used to rations of black bread mixed with sawdust and watery turnip soup, the sight of American mess halls was surreal. Trays carried scrambled eggs, oatmeal with sugar, bread that was white and soft, even fruit. The smell alone, sweet, yeasty, alive, triggered pangs of disbelief. One POW later recalled, "We had nothing left in Germany, no milk, no sugar, no coffee. And here, as prisoners, we had all of it. We ate until we felt ashamed." The irony was sharpened by numbers. Each prisoner in the United States was allotted 3,500 calories per day, including meat, vegetables, and dairy, all carefully regulated under the Geneva Convention. By contrast, civilians in war-torn Germany often survived on as little as 1,000 calories or less, scavenged from black markets or eked out from ration cards. Daily life in camp revolved around work details. Some were assigned to agricultural fields, others to kitchens or workshops. Women stitched uniforms, mended socks, peeled potatoes. In exchange, they received camp scrip, small paper chits printed with denominations, currency valid only inside the wire. With these, prisoners could purchase items at the camp canteen, toiletries, stationery, even chocolate bars. The paradox cut deep. A letter from one auxiliary named Marta captured the dissonance. "At home, my family waits hours for bread. Here I can buy a Hershey bar as if it were nothing. I eat and feel guilty with every bite." The sensory contrasts were constant. The clang of mess hall trays, the smell of stewing beef, the crisp starch of clean sheets on iron bunks. These were daily reminders that captivity in America looked nothing like the ruin of freedom in Germany. Even the climate struck them. Humid southern heat, chirping cicadas, thunderstorms that rattled barrack windows. It was a far cry from the bomb-blasted silence of Europe. And yet, it was still captivity. The wire fence glinted in the sun, and guards paced its perimeter. Prisoners marched in step to and from labor, saluted officers, and submitted to searches. The paradox of their lives was not freedom, it was dignity within confinement. The impact on morale was profound. Many women found themselves healthier than at any point during the war. Their faces filled out, cheeks lost their hollow look, hair regained its sheen. Some even laughed again, sharing songs in the evenings, trading stories across bunks. The Reich had promised them glory and delivered starvation. The enemy gave them 3 meals a day. But beneath the routine, an unease grew. Each letter received from home described hunger, rubble, disease. Mothers and siblings wrote of scraping coal from wreckage, of boiling weeds for soup. For the women behind barbed wire, abundance carried a new burden, shame. This tension would only sharpen in the weeks to come, when camp labor and canteen luxuries offered not just survival, but small tastes of comfort. And those comforts paradoxically became harder to bear than deprivation. Work details shaped the rhythm of captivity. In America's prisoner of war system, labor was both routine and regulated. The women found themselves dispatched to fields, canneries, and textile rooms, tasks chosen less for punishment than for productivity. Rows of prisoners stooped to harvest cotton under the southern sun, their hands raw with blisters. Others stitched uniforms or mended socks, the scrape of needles and hum of machines replacing the echoes of bomb sirens they had left behind. For their efforts, they were not paid in US dollars, but in camp scrip, small slips of paper currency printed with bland ink, stamped with denominations from 5 cents to $1. At first, the women laughed at the strange bills, convinced they were worthless. Then they discovered the canteens. Inside those wooden shacks, lined with shelves and humming refrigerators, they encountered a world unthinkable in war-ravaged Germany. Soap stacked in neat bars, toothpaste in shiny tubes, stationery, cigarettes, combs, and at the counter, the true luxuries, Hershey's chocolate bars, chewing gum, even small tins of lipstick. One prisoner, Erika Hoffman, later wrote, "I stood frozen before the counter. A chocolate bar was 2 scrip. At home, my brother had starved. How could I buy such a thing here as a prisoner?" The paradox was brutal. In Germany, civilians boiled weeds and ground acorns into flour. In America, behind barbed wire, women could casually unwrap foil and taste sweet chocolate melting on their tongues. The statistics sharpened the irony further. Across the US, camps issued millions of dollars worth of scrip between 1943 and 1946, creating closed economies that allowed prisoners to purchase comforts while maintaining Allied control of real currency. Prisoners earned roughly 80 cents per day equivalent for labor, enough to afford small indulgences. The sensory contrasts were unforgettable. The crisp snap of a chocolate bar breaking in half, the silky smear of lipstick applied before a mirror shard nailed to a barrack wall, the scent of tobacco curling in the night as women shared cigarettes on stoops. Each indulgence was both pleasure and torment, a reminder that they were better provisioned in captivity than their families were in freedom. Letters home carried that dissonance. One auxiliary confessed in writing, "Mother, forgive me. I send nothing because there is nothing to send. I am fed, even spoiled, while you queue for turnips. I cannot reconcile this." Some women sought refuge in denial, insisting the Americans only fattened them for propaganda photographs. Others clung to guilt, rationing their scrip, refusing to buy luxuries. But many surrendered to the small joys, reasoning that to refuse soap or chocolate would not fill a single stomach in Cologne or Dresden. Still, the paradox gnawed at them. They were prisoners who lived cleaner, ate better, and even looked healthier than they had under their own Reich. And as they worked beside Americans who offered casual greetings or bartered smiles for stitched uniforms, the certainty that the enemy was monstrous slipped further from their grasp. What began with soap was spreading small luxuries eroded the scaffolding of hate. Yet the greatest test lay not in rations or wages, but in human contact. In the coming weeks, the women would meet guards, farmers, and townsfolk whose simple decency shattered the last barriers of belief. The first encounters beyond the barbed wire began quietly, almost accidentally. Farmers who contracted POW labor watched in silence as German women bent to pick cotton or haul crates of vegetables. Many had expected defiance, even sabotage. Instead, they saw diligence. The prisoners had expected hatred. Instead, they received nods of acknowledgement, sometimes even a cup of water offered on a hot day. The paradox was subtle but profound. The enemy was no longer faceless. Inside the camps, guards walked the fences with rifles slung but not raised. Young American MPs, many barely older than the prisoners themselves, spoke in clipped English but sometimes softened their orders with gestures and half-smiles. A few even practiced broken German to make themselves understood. One auxiliary wrote in her diary, "He asked if I was cold and handed me a blanket. This was not the barbarian I was taught to fear." There were other moments that carved themselves into memory. When a storm rolled across Louisiana, lightning cracked the sky and rain battered the tin roofs. A guard opened a supply shed and passed out ponchos, grumbling in English, "Don't want you catching pneumonia." The women huddled under the coverings, stunned. Kindness from an enemy was more destabilizing than cruelty would have been. Statistics mark the breadth of these encounters. Across America, over 700 POW camps housed Germans, with at least a dozen processing female auxiliaries. Thousands of civilians came into contact with them: farmers, cooks, seamstresses, even schoolchildren who watched them march to work details. Each interaction was another fracture in the propaganda that had painted Americans as merciless. The sensory impressions lingered long after. The smell of fresh-cut hay while working farm fields under a wide American sky. The lowing of cattle instead of the howl of air raid sirens. The sight of small-town streets where houses stood unbroken, porches swept, and grocery shelves stocked. For women raised on ruins and fear, the normalcy was dizzying. Letters sent home struggled to capture this contradiction. One Red Cross nurse confessed in writing, "They treat us as if we are not enemies but simply people. I do not know how to explain it. I wish you could see it." Not every moment was gentle. Guards enforced discipline strictly, escape attempts were punished, and reminders of captivity never vanished. Yet the balance tilted unmistakably toward decency. The Reich had promised they would be stripped of humanity, but in America they found their humanity unexpectedly affirmed. The psychological weight was heavy. Each act of courtesy from a guard, each wave from a child at a fence line, deepened the guilt they felt reading letters from starving relatives in Germany. They were supposed to hate. They were supposed to resist. Instead, they were warming to their captors. The enemy was no longer the faceless monster of propaganda, but the young soldier sharing a cigarette, the farmer's wife who left an extra biscuit on a plate, the medic who checked a fever without cruelty. These moments reshaped their understanding more powerfully than any speech or pamphlet could. And as months turned into years, one truth became undeniable: captivity in America had changed them. Yet change carried a bitter edge, because while they grew healthier and less afraid, the day of return always loomed closer. Soon, they would face the greatest paradox of all, leaving behind comfort only to return to ruins. The war's end arrived not with gunfire but with silence. In May 1945, the news crackled over radios in camp command posts: Germany had surrendered. The women who had been auxiliaries of a fallen Reich stood in stunned stillness. Some wept, some prayed. Others simply stared at the dusty ground beneath their boots. For them, captivity had become routine. Now return was inevitable. The paradox cut deep. They had come to America as prisoners, expecting humiliation. Instead, they were healthier, cleaner, and in many ways freer than when they had marched in service of the Reich. Yet soon they would be sent home, not to abundance, but to ruins. The statistics of the devastation were staggering. By 1945, over 70% of German housing stock in major cities lay destroyed. Rationing was so severe that daily bread allowances dropped to just 1,000 calories in Berlin, half of what they received in captivity. America had built skyscrapers and supermarkets. Germany now had craters and soup kitchens. The contrast was brutal. Eyewitness accounts capture the emotional clash. One German auxiliary later wrote, "I dreaded the ship more than the capture. In America I was fed. At home I would starve." Another recalled watching from a transport train as American fields stretched endlessly with corn and wheat. "I thought, why do they have so much, and we have nothing?" The sense of injustice was almost unbearable. When the women disembarked in Europe, the air smelled of ash and dust instead of pine and soap. They exchanged the clang of American cafeteria trays for the scrape of empty pots. Families they had dreamed of reuniting with were broken, displaced, or gone. Some carried shame at their survival. Why had they, the captives, eaten better than their own kin? But captivity had left its imprint. They could not unsee the paradox of American abundance. They could not forget the soap, the bread, the books, the gestures of kindness from enemy guards. As one wrote decades later, "It was America that showed me how much of our world had been a lie." Historians estimate that over 400,000 German POWs experienced America firsthand. Their testimonies would ripple into post-war memory, shaping how Germans understood their defeat. They had come as soldiers and auxiliaries of a conquering regime, certain of their superiority. They left humbled, fed, and forever marked by a paradox they could never resolve. This wasn't set propaganda, it was reality. And reality was, America sits quiet victory. Because in the end, the greatest weapon was not bombs or bullets, but abundance. It was soap in a prison shower, butter on a cafeteria plate, kindness in the hands of a guard. The Reich had promised to create a master race through conquest. America had demonstrated power through generosity. They had come as conquerors, they left as students. And in the long shadow of war, it was this paradox, not destruction but dignity, that endured.